Please feel free if there's any questions that you have, get them off your chest now. Uh, I imagine some of you will just wait until you see what the presentation really includes, come up with some questions then. But if there's anything that you came into this with questions about, even if it's a little bit more broad about the admissions process, the application process, and business schools, happy to try to get to any questions that people have to the best of my ability. Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know people are going to be coming in over the next couple of minutes, but I'll start with just a little bit of a broad overview and introduction to me. And so I know the session will be recorded. There will also be a chance to watch at least the initial few minutes of the recording if you missed a few minutes. But today I want to talk a little bit about sort of looking ahead. This is really for people that are thinking of applying to business school in the coming year, essentially in the 2025, 2026 cycle to start school, presumably in 2026. The application first round admissions deadlines are going to be about 6 months from now. So we're about 6 months away. And essentially, I want to talk a little bit about what I do working with my clients, with about 6 months to go before the admissions deadlines, how we think essentially about making yourself a stronger applicant, not just coming up with a better application. So I want to start with just a little bit of background about me. My name is Mike. I've been working for about 25 years in what I consider to be leadership development. First and foremost, I think of myself as an educator. Worked at Stanford for 16 years, was there a total of 18 years, including the time that I did my MBA at Stanford. I came to Stanford initially in 2007 to help launch what is still today the core leadership curriculum in the Stanford MBA program called the Leadership Labs, the Arbuckle Leadership Fellows Program, and the GSB Executive Challenge. Helped to launch each of those initiatives. Co-founded Low Keynotes, which is sort of the public speaking forum at the GSB, revamped and oversaw the View from the Top, which is a CEO speaker series there for a few years. And then I took over the Stanford MSX program, which is the mid-career one-year program, overhauled that leadership curriculum, and led that program for a number of years. In that process, oversaw admissions for the MSX program for about a dozen years, recruited fellows into that program, worked very closely with MBA admissions. We use the same admissions system, helped to design certain aspects of that system, and really got to see the inner workings of the admissions process. But, I step back and say that partly to acknowledge that admissions is a part of education. And, I've spent a lot of time deeply thinking about, leadership development and how admissions fits into that broader goal. And so that's how I want to couch, what we talk about today as you think about applying to school in the coming year, that really this is part of your leadership journey. So let's start and just, talk about admissions broadly, like how most people think about the admissions process, right? There's, a number of stages. People, might be, already, or maybe you've already taken a test, or you're starting to think about, preparing for the GMAT or the GRE or a test like that. And you're looking ahead and you've got a lot of questions about, what I ought to be developing to put together the strongest application possible. And most people really look at the different elements of the application and how they're going to, develop the strongest, components of that, in terms of letters of recommendation and essays. What am I going to write about? How am I going to make my resume look, as impressive as possible? How am I going to, answer the questions in the application as effectively as possible? There's a lot of people that applied this year, at Stanford. Over the last 5 years, applications have been down. 5 consecutive years, we saw a little bit of a drop in the number of applications. Harvard, a lot of other programs saw something similar. In fact, at Stanford, I think in 2023 was about 20% lower than it was back in 2018. So it was, a significant drop over that 5-year period. My understanding is this year it's back up, so that's a big jump. And if you're looking at the markets and the sense of uncertainty in the economy right now, I got to imagine that next year is going to be even tougher. It's going to be a very, probably a banner year in terms of business school applications. So you don't necessarily want to just be thinking like, how do I apply in the typical way? You want to be thinking, how do I look at this process in the most strategic possible way? How do I put my best foot forward? How do I develop an application that's not just, good on each of the dimensions, but is good in a very holistic way? And so, really you want to step back. And I commend you, first of all, for, even showing up for a session like this, thinking 6 months out. You are, getting a step ahead. And a lot of people that 3-4 months out from the admissions process will start to really kind of think about, essentially, what do I need to do to put together a strong application? One of the nice things is 6 months out, there's still things that you can do that actually, are not just strengthening the application itself, but are strengthening your candidacy, that are actually, elements that will show up in your application, not by dint of what you write, but by dint of what you do and how you describe it in the application. And so that's the good news. And I want to encourage you to, make sure that you're planning to do your homework. And at the end, I'll talk about, essentially I'm going to do some future sessions, a 4-month application plan and a 2-month application plan. Hopefully you can join me for those. We'll be talking about slightly different things to be focusing on at that stage. But what I want to talk about today is sort of stepping back and looking at the expectations of each of these schools, holistically, understanding what it is that they're really trying to evaluate, thinking through essentially how am I going to project that or include that in my application in a holistic way. Sometimes people focus on the letter of recommendation separately from the resume, separately from the essays, and you really need to think about how those things work together effectively to show the school that across their expectations in terms of the criteria that they're using, that you really bring, some signature strengths. And I really encourage you to do this in a way that is in alignment with what you consider to be your sort of medium and long-term goals, right? Trying to get admitted to business school, I understand the sense of pressure. I understand the binary nature of it. I mean, believe me, I was the one who would call people and tell them that they were admitted to Stanford. I was the one whose email, name was on the rejection emails that went out to, most of the people that were applying. So I know the, sort of the excitement that comes from getting admitted. I know the disappointment that comes from not being admitted. But you do have to think about this as a longer term venture. Essentially the work that you do to prepare your application should be helping you actually take that first step and move in the direction of your longer term goals. I work with clients and people say, should I say this? Should I say that? I really don't ever advise someone to say something that's not truthful to them, that's not honest to them in terms of what they really want or what they believe. Just because they think that that's what the admissions office wants to hear. That's usually a recipe for struggling. I mean, even if you get into the school, and I know this from, more than a dozen years working with MBA students and MSX students at Stanford, the ones that took shortcuts during the admissions process and still managed to get admitted, I generally found that they, had a little bit more difficulty managing the sort of din of activities at a place like Stanford, or I'm sure Harvard, MIT, Chicago, Kellogg, any other great school, where every day you have all sorts of opportunities to select how you're going to focus your time, who you're going to spend it with, what subjects you're going to prioritize. And the people that did the best job essentially at really thinking through those things and grounding it in what their true interests were, what their passions are, what their strengths are, got to school and were better able to navigate that experience and get more from the experience. And so I want to encourage you to really think about the admissions process, not as simply, do I get in, do I not get in, but how is this preparing me for, what could be a great business school education, or even if I don't get into school, it's preparing me to, work in alignment with my, medium and long-term goals. So let's start with just understanding, what it is that schools are looking for. And I just picked Stanford and Harvard here. Obviously each school has its own specific criteria that they talk about. But when you look at Stanford and Harvard and you try to like merge the two, you get, essentially a set of criteria that can apply to most, if not all schools, or at least top schools. And so, Harvard changed their criteria a little bit this year. They talk about being business minded, leadership focused, growth oriented. Whereas Stanford, they changed some of the language that they use. This is actually I would say like the old language, but it's still very much, in alignment with what they say their criteria is. It's intellectual vitality, demonstrated leadership potential, and personal qualities and contributions, which they also use the terminology now, how you think, how you lead, how you view the world. But essentially it's those three criteria that they've been using for a number of years. I've spent some time working with applicants to the Harvard program. I've spent time, talking to colleagues that have worked at HBS over the years. It'll be interesting to see if they change anything up. They had a new director of admissions came in this year, so they may make some adjustments to their criteria in the next couple of years. But when I look at the two and really understand what it is that the GSB is looking for, what HBS is looking for, I came up with, essentially a merged set of criteria that I use, now with clients, which is a demonstrated leadership focus, goal-oriented intellectual rigor. This, sort of draws some of what HBS talks about when they talk about being business-minded. A growth mindset. I can tell you that's a big thing in, Stanford when they talk about intellectual vitality. It's as much about the sort of the curiosity, the openness to feedback and learning and sense of wanting to constantly improve as much as it is about being smart. Growth mindset is a term that, essentially stems from the research of Carol Dweck, who's in the psychology department at Stanford and is being used, across a lot of schools today. And then finally, values-based perspective, which is essentially, all of these schools are looking for diverse backgrounds. They are looking for people that come from different industries, different geographies, and who bring different points of view, and I'm not just talking about political views or, areas of interest as far as, business and industry, but, different views on what makes people tick, human nature and how you think about leadership. Some people are, very relationship oriented. Other people are very task oriented, and they want people that come in with, diverse perspectives, but they want people that, essentially have some self-awareness, can be articulate essentially about what their values are, and talk about it in a way that actually, can influence others in the program and foster, a open dialogue based on respect, but really give people the opportunity to reshape and be open to learning and take on new perspectives on leadership from their classmates. I mean, that is part of the magic of a really great MBA program, is you learn by osmosis in addition to what you're learning in the classroom, just by watching classmates that come from very different backgrounds, be effective in ways that, just seem kind of odd to you. But over time, you start to, integrate some of that understanding, some of that learning from just observation, right? So these are things that schools are really trying to maximize and optimize across, their applicant pool. And so, starting with a clear perspective on what is it that the schools are looking for, that's where we're going to start from. So you can think about, essentially how you're going to spend the next 6 months, sort of putting yourself in a position to, have the strongest base on which to submit an application, right? So what I'm talking about today is really how can you take the next 6 months, or let's say the next 4 months, really, sort of before you actually really start to put together the sort of the core of the application, and actually give yourself a bump, create some momentum so that you have more to talk about and some valuable opportunities to mine, as you're actually putting together the application. So there's three pieces to this that I, when I'm working with a client at this stage, this is essentially the sort of the focus of our work. This far out from an admission deadline, is to think about, essentially a personal assessment, leadership assessment, really. Thinking about some mentors or advisors to cultivate, to help you as you're starting to come together in terms of like your focus for your application. And these would be people that, could be potential recommenders. There may be people that you already know, like, hey, I've got two people, they're going to be my recommenders. But at this stage, I always encourage people to cast a slightly wider net, to have some backup options. And especially if you're going to be applying to multiple schools, there might be some recommenders that are a better fit for one school versus another school. And even if somebody's not going to be a recommender, but you think that they could have some valuable advice as you're sort of going through this process and thinking about your personal development, this is it. You can use the fact that you're planning to apply to business school as, an open door to get some, feedback, some advice, some mentorship, that, otherwise might be a little harder to sort of create that space for. So that's part two. Third is thinking about 2 to 3 projects, I call them. Sometimes they are formal projects, and sometimes they're more just, kind of a side activity or something that's kind of on my to-do list, but not a lot of tangible outcomes. But 3 areas of focus in terms of personal development over the next 4 to 6 months that you can, sort of focus on. Something that's rooted in your values, but with a strategic eye towards, here's the criteria that the school is looking for. Here's what my assessment of myself says right now. And so here's a few things that I can do over the next 4 to 6 months that I believe can, essentially help me strengthen my candidacy, sort of demonstrate my value proposition to the schools that I'm going to be applying to. So what you see on the screen here is a leadership assessment form. It's just the first page of a 2-page assessment. This comes from the Stanford GSB letter of recommendation form. It is also used in the Common App. So, Stanford put this together, but it's now used broadly by a number of schools, at least if you're applying to business school through the Common App. It has 12 competencies in it. So what you see here is just the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 7 here on page 1. I included the QR code here to just, it's a link to the form. I mean, this is on Stanford's website. Anybody can download it. And it's, really easy to just take this form and do a quick self-assessment on yourself. Just, sort of what would I give myself, score of 1 to 5 on each of these 12 different competencies. This, essentially, at least in the leadership portion of the application, as far as, I said earlier, Stanford has 3 criteria, one of which is demonstrated leadership potential. So, this gives you a roadmap, essentially, sort of a clear guide in terms of what are the things that they're actually looking for. And if you need evidence that Stanford actually takes this stuff pretty seriously, just read through the detail of this form, because, they don't simply just have 12 competencies and a scale of 1 to 5, say, hey, give me a score of 1 to 5. No, they actually detail, what does a 1 look like for initiative? What does a 2 look like? What does a 3 look like? And they describe in detail, what they expect and what that means to score a 3 or a 4 or a 5. What behaviors does that include? Now, there's actually 4 of the 12 criteria here that are a little bit, special, a little bit more that tend to be the basis for differentiation, I would say, within the admissions process. And I'll say them quickly. It's results orientation, team leadership, influence and collaboration, and strategic orientation. Now, that's not to say that if you get a low score on respect for others, let's say, that's not going to cost you significantly in the admissions process. It will, right? I mean, Stanford expects, sort of a certain they have expectations for each of the 12 criteria. But in terms of the ones that really tend to be the differentiators, in terms of like people that get 4s and 5s versus people that get 3s or maybe 2s, those are four that really, matter in terms of thinking about who's got the real leadership potential that we want to see, in the program, that we think, gives them, a strong predictability, essentially, that they'll do effective things after they graduate. We would often say at Stanford, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, right? Obviously, a place like Stanford, a place like Harvard, Chicago, any top school, it is going to boost you. It is going to help you, build a skill set, competencies that maybe you didn't have, or you didn't have as strongly as you would like. And yet, you are a well-formed adult by the time you're applying to business school in most cases. And so, a lot of your sort of behavioral habits and expectations are already pretty well formed. And so, this is, something that the school takes seriously. And it's something that you can use to, essentially do a little honest, inventory on yourself in terms of, where do you think, what are a few of these that you think are come somewhat naturally to you, or you've had enough experience with where you feel like, this is now sort of part of my process. I don't have to, think too hard to, sort of do well in this area. Those are your strengths. And one of the fundamental facts of leadership development, that I've been involved in, is that we tend as humans to focus on our weaknesses, right? We tend to put more attention on the areas where we think that, we're not doing as well, and think, what can I do to mitigate that weakness? What can I do to, sort of improve in that area? And yet, from a leadership development perspective, there's a lot of research that shows that time spent leveraging your strengths and figuring out how to, use your strengths effectively is actually, there's significantly more ROI. So the first thing I want you to think about is, do a little self-assessment and recognize what are the strengths. What are the areas where I think like I actually do pretty well here? I think I can lean in on these areas and sort of hold on to that, because, as you think about projects to work on, you want to make sure that some of it is really based on like, how can I leverage these strengths? Like where are these strengths most effective? You also want to identify, some areas where maybe you're not as strong. And that may not be because you don't have the capacity for it. But look, if you're 3 or 4 years into your work career, there's a lot of stuff that you just haven't had much opportunity to demonstrate yet. If you're not a team leader, or decision maker, key decision maker, then, there's some of these leadership traits that will just take more time for you to gain practice or gain exposure. And so recognize that, there may be some things that you're going to score a little bit lower on, not because you're bad, but just because in the purview of your work, you don't have a lot of time or a lot of focus in that area. And then finally, you want to take this, assessment that you've done of yourself. You want to, reflect on it a little bit and identify like what are 2 or 3 elements in this, as far as these competencies or capabilities, or you can even drill down into the specific, behaviors in the 1 to 5, sort of scores, where you say like, I want to, do something where I can sort of move my score up a little bit, or move how people perceive me or how I perceive myself in this area up a little bit. And some of that might be to mitigate a weakness or an area for development. Some of it might be to recognize that like, hey, I've got a strength that I'm already pretty good at, but if I could get a little bit better at, I could really, have an impact. And then third, and this is really key and where a coach can be very valuable, is recognize that there are connections between some of these competencies where, strategic orientation alongside the ability to influence and collaborate, like together, can be very, very powerful. And maybe you're strong in one area, but not quite as strong in the other area. And if you could just bring that up a little bit, the sort of the magnified potential of those strengths together can really help you. Communication tends to be one of those strengths where it's got a lot of synergies with other strengths. Someone who's a real strategic thinker, if they can communicate effectively, they're going to be much more powerful as a leader than, even someone who's like the world-class strategic thinker who's not as effective in terms of communicating. So you want to do a little bit of assessment and think about, like, what are a couple areas where I can, sort of build my strengths or address some areas for development. The second piece, and we'll talk about how all these sort of fit together, but the second piece is thinking about, some mentors that you can cultivate over the next 4 to 6 months, right? And if you're thinking about applying to business school, you'll have to think about recommenders. And I use this with clients to just basically say, okay, let's come up with a list. Let's cast a wide net, figure out, who are some potential recommenders, people you've worked with who have been supervisors or, more senior to you. In some cases, it might be a former faculty or teacher that, that you see as someone who's kind of a mentor intellectually or otherwise. It might be, people that you haven't worked with directly, but, you've come to know over the years and you see them as kind of wise, wise voices. Take the opportunity. I recognize sometimes this forces you to step outside your comfort zone, but hopefully you can approach folks like this and just say, look, I'm planning to apply, or I'm thinking of applying to business school next year, and it would be really helpful if I could, get coffee with you or sit down and have a chat with you about my goals and how I'm thinking about this. Give them a little bit of background in terms of like why you're thinking about going to business school and how it fits into kind of medium to long-term goals that you have for yourself, and use it as an opportunity to, have an initial conversation with them, just sort of get some feedback, ask them for any career advice they have based on what you share as your goals. Think about how you might make yourself into a stronger candidate or, essentially advance towards those goals, get some insight from them. If you have some preliminary ideas about, any projects that you might work on, which we'll get to talking about, you can share that with them, but you can also just ask like, hey, what do you think I can do in the next 3 to 6 months in terms of stretch projects that might, essentially help me develop, and by the time that I actually submit my application, I'll have a little bit more to talk about in terms of career accomplishments and, pushing myself and stretching myself as a leader. So you get a little bit of conversation going and advice. And then this is critical, is you want to end by saying, hey, is it okay if I check in with you every couple months? You want to make sure that you have a chance to, check in with them, both to update them on, essentially what you've been working on, progress, as well as get their input. And by the time that you are ready to confirm, who's going to be your recommender, you'll be in a much better position to, ask any of these folks to be a recommender. And really, hopefully, you want people that are really an evangelist for you, that are going to be a strong advocate for you, and people that are knowledgeable about you, both tactically in terms of they've been able to observe you in a work capacity, so they have some real kind of detailed knowledge of how you work, but also, stepping back and thinking strategically about your goals more holistically. And if they've had these conversations with you over the 6 month, they're going to have a much better informed perspective on what your potential is and what your future might hold, because you'll have, in some sense, envisioned it together by having a few conversations like this. You can always wait and, ask your boss or ask, for a recent boss to write a letter of recommendation for you, and they might do a fantastic job. But I find that this builds a little bit of, sort of higher expectation, greater willingness on their part to, to support you if you've essentially seeded the ground and sort of provided them with this opportunity. So now the third part, essentially is coming up with a few projects, a few initiatives that you can work on over the next 3 to 6 months, essentially, that are, that might end up being bullet points on your resume. They might end up being subjects of discussion in your essays. They might be things that some of your recommenders end up talking about because you've been, going back and forth with them about these efforts. Even if none of that ends up being the case, like, you will be in a place where you will, I believe, like, sort of creating your own personal capital by, I mean, this is something you should be doing every 6 months anyway, right? Is sort of stepping back and thinking about, okay, on top of what I have to get done for my job, what are a few things that I can be working on that are focused on my personal development, making myself a stronger, more capable, better leader, and showing that I can have some real impact in the world, right? So this is just something that you ought to be doing kind of as a basis for, for whatever it is that you want to accomplish over the course of your career. But with an eye towards applying to business school, it's particularly important to, to create a little bit of momentum for yourself, so that when you're going to submit your application, that you both have a feeling personally, as well as, you've got things that you can point to and show that demonstrate that, you're actually getting stuff done right now. You're sort of in a period of acceleration in your career, with some momentum behind you, because that, when I'm reading a letter of recommend, or when I'm reading an application, I would sometimes, sort of talk with our readers and reviewers. And one thing that I would, every year I would have a little talk where I'd say, look, at the end of the day, we can put applications into two piles. There's the people that, say essentially that, hey, I want to go to Stanford. I've reached most of my goals, but, I haven't reached them all. And as a result of going to Stanford, that's going to help me, essentially accomplish the goals that I have for myself. And that's generally not the applications that we were going to, admit to the program. The other pile were the people that said, hey, I've accomplished all the goals that I've, set for myself over these last few years. And now I need to set new goals. And that's why I'm coming to Stanford, is to, essentially broaden my horizons and, heighten my expectations. And those are the people that, essentially we would want to admit and, see at the school, and felt like they were going to make the most of the experience. And going through a process like this of identifying stretch opportunities to pursue, I mean, that's very much a part of that process, to never settle, or to at least show, as you're going into this admission season, that, you're someone that can, be self-driven, aspirational, achievement oriented or results oriented, but also self-reflective. And so what you want to do here is identify 2 or 3 things. And this is not a comprehensive set of different things that you might be looking at. But many of the projects or initiatives that I've, worked on with clients, they might kind of be a combination of 2 or 3 of these things, right? They're not, these are not necessarily totally distinct, but these are different things that you can be thinking about as far as, like, goals or outcomes, or ancillary benefits of, some efforts that you make over this period of time, where essentially you set some goals, and, think about building in some time, creating a little bit of a work plan to accomplish, what it is that you set out to do. And, essentially this is rooted in understanding your leadership assessment, and kind of where there's opportunities for you to strengthen your profile in the eyes of an admissions office, but also, consistent with your own career goals, and things that are going to feel consistent with, a set of values that you hold. So you want to sort of step back and think about how these things sort of tie together. You want to have goals for each of your projects, whatever it is that you decide that you're working on. You want to discuss these with your, call them your advisory board, your mentors, advisors that you've, had some conversations with. Get their input, to think about, how to make the most of them. And then, You want to, essentially root it in something that feels like it's important to you in terms of your values. Because when you get to talk about essays, personal statements, or answering a question like Stanford's "What matters most to you and why," or Harvard, asking you about, how have you demonstrated that you're business minded, or demonstrated, your focus on leadership. You want to be able to talk about yourself as sort of coming from some perspective of values, and that term values can be loosely defined for now. I can spend an hour or more talking to you just about that, that word values, as it relates to leadership development, as it relates to business school admissions. But it means essentially something that's personal to you, that feels like it's connected to who you are. Whether that might just be, hey, this is something that I really like doing. It might be a personal passion, or it might be something that you feel was fused into you as a kid because of the way that you were brought up in terms of how you view your sort of mission in life, or your how you move through the world each day. But you want to pay attention to that as you're thinking about these projects and how they connect to that, because you will want to, in your personal statement or essays, show essentially how some of the things how you're spending your time and how you're making your decisions tie together with who you are, and how how that makes sense, and how you can communicate that to someone who doesn't know you, who's essentially reviewing hundreds of applications, and trying to figure out like who here really has something a little bit special about them. And so this is something that you can try to do on your own. I do, part of the reason I suggest having some mentors and advisors is like having some dialogue is really helpful to, sort of put voice to how you're thinking about why these projects are relevant to you, and how they might help you, both in terms of like skills development as well as connection to your values, like, sort of tie it all together. This is where a coach can be helpful, in guiding you a little bit, especially someone who has worked in admissions and has, sort of reviewed a lot of applications and has some, sense of how these things come together either well or maybe not so well in applications. Now, once all of this is sort of in place, like once you sort of have identified, okay, here's my assessment, here's a few things that I believe are strengths that I'm going to be able to talk about already in the application. Here's a couple areas where maybe I'm not so strong, but I understand that, and I thought through a little bit how I might mitigate some of those areas for development. And here's what I'm going to work on over the next 2 to 3 months. We would run things like this. We would do self-assessments for our MBA students at Stanford, and we would always target, like, look, you want to focus on 1 or 2 or 3 of these things. You don't want to focus on 6 or 8 in terms of what you're going to try to work on over the next 90 days or 120 days. That's usually what we would use as kind of a period where we would focus on a specific plan. And so you want to be strategic about, what competencies that you're going to try to work on. Once you have that, and once you've, identified who are your mentors, your advisors, and set up, essentially an expectation that you'll be able to check in with them, a couple of times, 3 times, maybe between now and when you are ready to submit your application or request essentially your recommendations. And then once you've identified, here's, a few projects that I'm going to be working on over the next 3 to 6 months that I think are going to, strengthen my profile essentially, and strengthen my value proposition from the perspective of, the schools that I'm interested in. Once you've got that in place, then you can, sort of go back and look at the, the basic building blocks of the admissions process. Look, if you need to, take the GMAT or the GRE, you do want to make sure that you leave enough time where I generally recommend 90 days, to give yourself time to build up, to be prepared. Take a course by all means, if that, is gonna help you, but at the very least, some study and some discipline to spend a little bit of time consistently over a period of time to prepare for the GMAT or the GRE test is generally very, very helpful. Way back when I took the GMAT, I didn't have access to like test prep or courses, but I did have, essentially a book of GMAT questions, and 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 2 months or something like that, where it wasn't extensive, it wasn't hard, backbreaking or anything like that, but it made a huge difference. I generally advise that discipline and focus, because a higher score is always better than a lower score. I don't, people are always looking for what's the magic number, and there's no such thing. But if you're going to business school, you should know something about statistics. And, if you give me a test score, I can tell you what the percentage chance of someone being admitted is, right? And it's always a little bit higher for the people that have a really high score. It's a little bit lower for people that have a lower score. So you want to do as well as possible, essentially given your capabilities. Essentially you want to be thinking about other steps that you're taking to actually, assemble an application. I'm going to be doing a session in 2 months, that I call the 4-month app prep plan. That'll focus a little bit more on kind of due diligence on schools that you're looking at, because I think that is an important and sometimes undervalued aspect to applications. I mean, if you have the luxury to go and visit schools, that's great. There's no better way to really get a feel for kind of the culture and the environments and kind of how people think and talk on campus than getting a chance to sit in on a class or talk to people in person at the campus. But obviously, you can get all sorts of information online as well, and you can connect with people, live, virtually, online pretty easily as well. And so, I'll be talking a little bit about, some steps that you can do to kind of give yourself that, that leg up as you're, starting to get more focused on applications. And then, 2 months out, I'll sort of spend a little, I'll do a session that, sort of looks at, narrating your story and thinking about how the different pieces of the application kind of fuse or fit together. I know there's a lot of coaches that do that, and so focus on that. So, I'll give you my perspective if you choose to sit in on that session. But, I want to recognize that what I'm talking about today is really kind of a set of activities that is best done starting now, 6 months out from an application deadline. Because, when you get 2 months out, it's kind of too late at that point to you can change the words in your application, but you're not going to change the underlying narrative, right? I mean, there's things that you can't change about yourself even now, right? You can't go back and change the grades that you got when you were an undergrad. You can't go back and change where your first job was out of business, out of undergrad. You can't go back and change who you worked with, 2 or 3 years ago. But, there's I would say, a significant part of what an admissions officer is looking at is in the application. I mean, they're obviously looking at your prior academics, they're looking at your overall career trajectory, but in the last 6 months, 6 to 9 months before you apply to the school, like that's a crucial element of what they're, weighing and considering in terms of like where you're at today. If there's something you can do that gets you a promotion in the next 6 months, if there's something that you can do that, demonstrates, hey, you knocked it out of the park with this project, or, you created a sort of a new network for yourself, or you, did something on the side that had some real social benefit, those things really matter. And I would say that the closer it is into the application season, it's that much more valuable than something that happened, say, 3 years ago. So this is a very crucial time, I would say, in the admissions journey, where you actually have still a little bit of time to make some impact, to, create some wins for yourself. And at the same time, do it in a way that's focused strategically on, I know I'm applying to business school next fall or next winter, and I want to, do as much as I can to create that little bit of a sense of momentum. Um, Before we break, and I'm going to, sort of take any questions that you might have, I do want to just reiterate again that admissions is part of a broader journey. Like I really, you know, at Stanford, I would have people tell me, hey, one of the questions that gets asked a lot at Stanford is, hey, what did you write in the What Matters Most essay? Like, students there like to talk about that. They like to share and hear what their classmates said. And, you would hear people sometimes say like, oh, I said what I thought the admissions office needed to hear. Right. And it would be almost like a little bit of a cynical, sort of perspective. My observation is that those students did not do themselves a great service. I mean, they got in, so my hat off to them, and maybe they wouldn't have gotten in if they'd written something a little bit more honest. Like, look, I'm not going to blow smoke and say that admissions is perfect and they always find, the person that's the most authentic. You'll find other people that'll say that. I have a lot of humility as someone who was ultimately responsible for the decisions of, who's admitted to programs at Stanford. There's people who say, we never made a mistake. I can tell you, I made mistakes. And, I think students did too, in some cases, but I think the students that really looked at this as a opportunity to, think deeply, to reflect, to, sort of be real with themselves first, and then, sort of share that with the admissions office. They were preparing themselves for having a great experience in business school. They got to school, they were ready to engage in a way that students who, essentially just kind of try to come up with, what's the best thing to say, struggled with. And especially at places like Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, every day there's so many different activities going on in addition to all the classes you can take. There's, lots of clubs, there's lots of guest speakers, there's, social activities, there's, personal development activities, there's entrepreneurial opportunities. And more than anything, you're surrounded by hundreds of people that are, type A, like, very confident, inspiring, who, are talking about whatever the latest thing is, right? I'm going into private equity. I'm going into, I'm going to start a company and, that's focused on AI and education, or, I'm doing crypto. I'm doing this. I'm, focused on sustainability. And it's easy to be pulled in 5 or 6 different directions. And one of the things that I saw consistently was, people having to fight that, desire, because they are so intellectually curious, to be pulled in several directions at the same time. And unfortunately, when you're being pulled in several different directions, it means you're not actually moving, in one direction. You're certainly not moving in a clear direction towards your goals. In many respects, you're sort of undermining yourself by not having the focus and the discipline to be able to prioritize effectively and say no, to 75% of those opportunities that are constantly coming your way. I believed, and would always sort of advise students that, look, you don't want to simply keep these things off your plate so that you can, focus on the classes and opportunities that are, highest priority to you. You actually want to leave some empty space. You want to, sort of give yourself the opportunity to create some opportunities that otherwise wouldn't be there, right? I mean, that's the magic of a great school, is there's all this human capital and a lot of willingness for people to engage with you and support you. And so you want to create the conditions where when you get to school, you're really going to be able to thrive and make the most of it. And the admissions process is part of that journey. So I say, start your education now. Use this, next few months to, in a sense, kind of create the ramp on which you're going to, essentially project yourself into school, but also that, you're going to use as you get to school to kind of continue your education and development. So I'm going to stop there. I will say that, Again, I'm looking at the admissions cycle that is, essentially ending or is about to end. Coming up with round three, deferred admissions, and things like that this year. Um, you know, I have seen, even though the numbers aren't out, officially yet, that applications were up very significantly. Next year is going to be very demanding, very competitive. You do want to make sure that you're being thoughtful, being strategic, if it is your plan to apply to business school in the coming year. I'm more than happy to meet with anybody who contacts me, set up a 15-minute intro call and kind of go over, a few basics in terms of your profile. As a coach, I try to give as much advice, feedback, insight as I can in that 15 minutes. I don't try to like hold that back and say, hey, you gotta pay me to get any sort of candy or any good stuff. You can mind me for 15 minutes and get my thoughts in terms of anything that I think can be helpful to you as you think about essentially applying to business school, or just more broadly your career goals. But I will say that I generally prefer to work with people in a sort of a comprehensive package basis. I don't like to count hours and try to sort of optimize, like, how are we going to use this 15 minutes. I try to be generous with my clients when they're working with me in a comprehensive package, and set up meetings on a cadence that allows them to get the most out of that experience. And I've had the most success with essentially clients that are working with me in a comprehensive basis. And so last piece of advice I have is, if you are going to work with a coach in the coming cycle, book them now, especially if you're going to do a comprehensive package in any respect, because you don't want to try to squeeze hours into a shorter period of time. It's much better if you're able to spread it out, because it gives you more time as you engage with a coach to to build a sense of momentum. Like, having a cadence over 6 months can be incredibly powerful. And at least when I work with clients, I do try to bring a leadership development perspective first. And admissions is kind of a lens